There are places on this planet that feel less like land and more like mistakes. Places that seem to exist only because the ocean hasn't finished its work yet. Tromelin Island is one of them. A low strip of sand and coral in the Indian Ocean. So flat that from a distance it almost disappears into the horizon. No trees to break the wind. No rivers to follow inland. No soil to hold water. Just heat, salt, and a wind that never seems to stop moving. For centuries, sailors marked it on charts and moved on, convinced of one thing: nothing human could survive there. The island offers no comfort. The sun presses down without mercy. The sand reflects heat upward, burning the soles of bare feet. When storms arrive, they don't politely pass around the island. They swallow it. Cyclones surge over the land, erasing footprints, tearing apart anything fragile, reminding the ground itself how temporary it is. Even today, the highest point barely rises higher than a man's shoulders. It is not a place meant for memory. It is a place designed to forget. That is why, for generations, Tromelin was ignored. No settlements, no legends, no recorded history worth telling. Just a nameless patch of sand in the middle of too much water. And then, in 2006, something impossible happened. Archaeologists arrived expecting silence. Birds, salt, maybe debris washed in from passing ships. Instead, beneath the concrete base of a weather station built decades earlier, they struck bone. Not animal bone, human bone. And beside it, objects that made no sense in a place like this. Crude copper spoons shaped by hand, bowls beaten from ship metal, shell ornaments worn smooth by skin, foundations of shelters built from coral blocks, stacked thick enough to resist hurricane winds. These were not the remains of people who waited to die. They were the traces of people who lived, people who cooked, people who made tools, people who built homes where homes should not have been possible, people who stayed long enough to leave behind structure, routine, and proof of community. The island had not erased them. Somehow, they had resisted it. But Tromelin does not give up its stories easily. The sand shifts constantly. The wind scours away evidence. The sea takes what it wants back. If these people had lived here, the world had forgotten them so completely that even their suffering left no obvious record. No names on maps, no monuments, no graves marked with intention. So the question hangs, heavy and unavoidable. Who were these people? How did they arrive on a strip of land that offers no mercy? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, if no one could live here, if no one was supposed to live here, then why were they left behind? The answers do not begin with heroism. They do not begin with rescue. They begin with a crime carried quietly across the ocean, a decision made on a ship that should never have carried human cargo, and a night when coral tore wood apart and survival became unevenly distributed, divided not by strength or chance, but by who the world had decided mattered. To understand the bones beneath the weather station, you have to go back to the moment Tromelin stopped being empty and became a prison no one intended to return to. The crime did not begin with chains clanking in the dark. It began with paperwork, with orders written carefully enough to sound reasonable and flexible enough to be ignored. The ship was called l'Utile, a transport vessel of the French East India Company, built to carry goods, not people. Its purpose was trade, sugar, spices, profit that could be measured and insured. Human beings were not part of the plan, at least not on paper. In June of 1761, l'Utile left Port Louis on the island then known as Île-de-France. The captain, Jean de Lafargue, had been given clear instructions: do not bring enslaved people back to the colony. War with Britain had turned the Indian Ocean into a hunting ground for enemy ships. Supplies were thin. Extra mouths meant risk. The governor wanted none of it. The order was explicit enough to protect those who issued it, and vague enough to be bypassed by those who stood to gain. Lafargue did not see himself as a criminal. Men rarely do when profit smooths the edges of disobedience. On Madagascar's east coast, at a place where human lives were already priced and traded, he took on around 60 Malagasy captives. Men and women from coastal communities seized and sold into a system that reduced their future to ledger entries. They were forced into the ship's hold, pressed into darkness so complete that time lost its shape. The air was hot, thick with breath and fear. Bodies were packed tight, not because cruelty demanded it, but because efficiency did. At night, the hatches were locked. The logic was simple. Locked hatches prevented revolt. Revolt endangered cargo. Cargo endangered profit. The people below deck were treated as what the system called them, contraband that breathed, valuable if delivered, disposable if lost. Their suffering did not require malice. It required indifference administered methodically. Among them was a young woman named Simiavo. Her name meant the humble one, a name that would later outlast almost everything else. She was pregnant, though not yet visibly so, carrying a child into a future that had already been stolen from her. In the hold, she learned quickly how to make herself small, how to breathe shallowly when the air grew thin, how to listen for changes in the ship's movement that signaled danger or punishment. Survival, even then, was an act of attention. On July 27th, Luteal sailed again, heavy with illegal cargo and heavier with risk. To avoid British patrols, Lafargue plotted a cautious route, relying on charts that had not been corrected for reefs that moved and shifted like living things. The sea was calm. The speed was moderate. Nothing about the night of July 31st suggested catastrophe, until it did. The lookout saw pale water ahead, foam where there should have been depth. The warning came seconds too late. The ship struck coral with a force that tore away the rudder. Wood screamed as planks split. The hull twisted, and the sea rushed in with the impatience of something reclaiming what it had always owned. Above deck, the French crew reacted as people always do when given options. They ran. They cut lines. They threw themselves into the water. Below deck, the enslaved were still where they had been put, locked in. Water poured into the hold, rising fast, turning panic into physics. Some broke free as the ship's structure failed. Many did not. The difference between life and death was not strength or will, but access. Freedom, unevenly distributed, became lethal in minutes. By morning, the survivors gathered on a narrow strip of sand surrounded by wreckage and bodies. 18 French sailors had drowned, 72. Malagasy captives were dead, many still trapped below when the ship finally broke apart. The living had escaped a sinking vessel only to find themselves stranded on a place that offered no forgiveness for survival. The hierarchy did not dissolve with the wreck. It followed them ashore. The French claimed the best ground. They controlled what mattered, salvaged casks of water and wine, tools pulled from the reef, decisions about who drank and who waited. The Malagasy were kept downwind, separated, as if distance itself could preserve the old order. The sun burned. Thirst arrived quickly. Within days, dozens of Malagasy died from dehydration and exposure, while the French, rationing their supplies, lost no one to thirst. The cruelty was not loud. It did not shout or strike. It measured, it allocated. It asked, quietly and efficiently, whose lives were worth the effort of saving. And all of it, every death, every locked hatch, every withheld cup of water fit neatly within a system that was never meant to be seen. Slavery did not end when the ship broke apart on the reef. It simply changed its shape. On Tromelin, the chains were no longer iron, but control over what kept a body alive. Shade, water, tools, distance from the sun. These things became currency, and the old hierarchy decided who held them. The French survivors established themselves on the higher ground, such as it was, closer to the wreckage and the salvage supplies. The Malagasy were pushed farther downwind, where the heat was harsher and the air carried less mercy. The separation was deliberate. It recreated the order everyone understood, even on an island that should have erased it. Power did not need whips. It only needed to decide who drank first. Thirst arrived faster than hunger. Within days, lips cracked, skin burned, and bodies weakened under a sun that did not negotiate. Dozens of Malagasy collapsed from dehydration and exposure. They died quietly, without ceremony, while the French rationed their water and wine carefully, counting cups, measuring survival. Not a single Frenchman died of thirst in those first days. The imbalance was not accidental. It was administered. Cruelty on Tromelin was rarely dramatic. It appeared in gestures so small they could be denied. Who held the ladle? Who stood in the shadow of a salvaged sail? Who was told to wait? Each choice reinforced the same message the hold of Luteal had delivered. Some lives were meant to endure, others to be spent. Eventually, desperation forced a decision that looked almost like cooperation. Someone suggested digging. 5 meters down through coral sand, hands blistered and bleeding, they struck moisture. The water was brackish and unpleasant, but it was water. Survival recalculated itself instantly. Not because anyone recognized shared humanity, but because arithmetic changed. If anyone was going to leave Tromelin alive, labor would have to be shared. Command passed to the first officer, Barthélemy Castellon du Vernet. The captain, Lafargue, had collapsed into a stupor that resembled madness, likely crushed by fear of punishment for illegal slaving and by the weight of what his decisions had caused. Castellon was different. Disciplined, cold. His brother had drowned in the wreck, but grief did not soften him. It sharpened him. He understood systems, and Tromelin demanded one. He organized salvage operations on the reef, directing men to pull timber and iron from the sea. He oversaw the construction of a forge made from sand, stone, and desperation. Fires were fed with debris. Metal was heated and hammered into nails. Tools were shaped from wreckage. And the Malagasy, kidnapped, imprisoned, nearly drowned, worked on these projects with relentless focus. The French described their labor as remarkable. They marveled at the effort, as if survival were a surprising motivation. But effort was not loyalty. It was necessity. When your life depends on a boat being finished, you do not conserve strength for pride. Castellon understood that labor required incentive. He offered something that functioned as both promise and control. When they reached safety, he swore, a ship would be sent back for those left behind. He put the promise in writing. A certificate signed by officers, praising the Malagasy for their work and pledging rescue. In a world governed by paper, Castellon produced paper. It was the only currency he had left. For 2 months, the survivors built a lifeboat from the remains of l'Outil. It was crude and ungainly, but it floated. They named it La Providence, as if invoking divine mercy might balance the choices already made. But the sea does not bargain with names. The boat could carry about 120 people. There were roughly 180 survivors. The math was obvious long before the morning it had to be answered. When the day came, the decision was made with an efficiency that echoed everything that had led them there. The French boarded first, every one of them. They loaded salvaged possessions, supplies, and among the items chosen for preservation were religious objects from the ship's chapel. A portable altar, a crucifix. Symbols of faith were saved carefully, even as the people who had built the boat watched from the shore. Around 60, Malagasy men and women stood on the sand, their work complete, their fate sealed. Simeavo was among them, now visibly pregnant. Castellon addressed them one last time, repeating the pledge written on the certificate. He would return, as soon as possible. Supplies were left behind. Biscuits, salted meat, tools, muskets, instructions for keeping a signal fire burning. The gestures resembled generosity, but they were also a way of leaving without looking back. La Providence pushed off and became a dark line against a bright horizon. The hierarchy remained, intact and unquestioned. It simply sailed away. The morning did not arrive with arguments or raised voices. There was no riot, no last-minute negotiation, no open violence. The cruelty of that day did not need noise. It only needed numbers. The boat they had built could not lie. La Providence sat low in the water even before anyone stepped aboard. Its sides were rough, its seams imperfect, its balance fragile. Everyone could see it. Everyone understood what it meant. The boat could carry around 120 people. On the island, there were close to 180 survivors. The difference between those numbers was not abstract. It was human. There was no formal announcement of who would stay and who would go. The decision expressed itself through movement. The French gathered their belongings and walked toward the boat. One by one, they climbed aboard. No one stopped them. No one challenged the order. The hierarchy that had governed life in the ship's hold and on the sand now determined who was light enough to matter. The Malagasy watched. They did not rush the boat. They did not beg or shout. They stood where they had been told to stand, as they always had, and observed the final transaction. Their labor had built the means of escape. Their presence now exceeded its capacity. Among the items carried onto the boat were objects that seemed almost surreal in that moment. Religious artifacts salvaged from the ship's chapel, a portable altar, a crucifix, carefully preserved symbols of faith chosen and protected while human beings remained behind. The message was unspoken, but clear. Some things were worth saving, even when people were not. Simeavo stood on the beach, the curve of her pregnancy now impossible to hide. She had survived the hold, the wreck, the thirst, the labor. She had helped shape the nails and timbers that now carried others away. She watched as the last Frenchman stepped aboard and the boat settled deeper into the water, balanced perfectly at the edge of disaster. Castellon spoke to the abandoned group one final time. His voice carried across the sand, measured, controlled. He repeated the promise. A ship would return as soon as possible. He had written it down. He had signed it. He wanted them to believe that paper could still matter. Then came the gestures meant to soften the act. 3 months of supplies were left behind. Biscuits, salted meat, tools, muskets for hunting birds, instructions for keeping a signal fire burning so rescuers could find them. The supplies were practical, even generous, but they could not disguise what they were. They were an apology delivered in objects, a way of easing departure without changing the outcome. The boat was pushed into the water. The surf resisted briefly, then released it. Oars dipped. The sail caught light. La Providence moved away from the island, becoming smaller with every stroke. The people on the beach followed it with their eyes, not because they believed in the promise, but because watching was the only thing left to do. Silence settled after the sound of the waves. The horizon did not break. No second boat appeared. The line where sea met sky remained empty. The people left behind did not collapse into chaos. There was no immediate screaming, no frantic running, no violent grief. Shock held them upright. They turned away from the water slowly, as if turning too fast might break something inside them. Survival, once again, demanded routine. 4 days later, La Providence reached Madagascar. Castellone reported the stranded survivors immediately. He spoke of the men and women left on Tromelin, of the promise made, of the supplies, of the urgency. The response he received was the first of many refusals. British warships controlled the waters, officials said. There were no spare vessels. The risk was too great. When Castellone reached Port Louis and appealed directly to the governor, the answer grew colder. The governor did not deny that people had been abandoned. He denied that they were worth the effort. They were illegal cargo, obtained in defiance of orders. Proof of a crime. Why risk French lives to retrieve evidence of disobedience? The world had made its choice quietly, just as it had on the beach. Those who fit on the boat had sailed away. The rest were left to see whether survival alone could count as mercy. When the boat vanished beyond the horizon, the island did not change. The sun still burned. The wind still scoured the sand. The sea still circled patiently, indifferent to who had been chosen and who had been left. What changed was the rhythm of life. Rescue, once imagined as an event, became an idea that had to be rationed carefully, like water. Too much hope could kill as surely as despair. The people on Tromelin turned back from the shore and began the slow work of not dying. Food came grudgingly. The island offered sustenance the way prisons offer kindness, sporadically and at a cost. Seabirds nested in vast numbers from November to March, laying eggs in shallow scrapes across the sand. Sea turtles came ashore at night, heavy and vulnerable, to lay theirs. Fish could be taken in the shallows at low tide. The survivors learned these patterns the way desert travelers learned clouds. Survival became a matter of attention and memory. Shelter came from coral. Blocks were cut and stacked into walls thick enough to resist the wind. In Madagascar, stone houses were often reserved for tombs. To live inside stone was to flirt with taboo. Tromelin demanded taboo. It demanded that old rules be broken in order for life to continue. The shelters were low and narrow, designed not for comfort, but for endurance. When cyclones arrived, they became refuges where people pressed against stone as the world outside turned into noise. From the wreckage of Lutil, they made what the sea had not finished destroying into tools. Copper and iron were shaped into hooks, blades, nails. Utensils followed, spoons, bowls, objects that did more than feed the body. They structured meals. They created the possibility of shared time. Shells were drilled and polished into ornaments. These were not luxuries. They were statements. In a place that reduced life to appetite, beauty became a refusal. A fire burned continuously. It cooked food, hardened tools, sent smoke into the sky as a signal. But it also became something else, a measure of time, a line drawn against disappearance. As long as the fire lived, the community lived. Someone tended it every day through sickness, through grief, through exhaustion. Letting it die felt like surrender. Children were born on Tromelin. First cries carried by wind instead of walls. First words spoken in Malagasy, shaped by isolation. First steps taken on sand that burned in the sun. The births did not feel like hope at first. They felt like risk. Every child was another mouth to feed. Another life exposed to storms and scarcity. But children also anchored the survivors to the future. They demanded routine. They forced the adults to imagine tomorrow. The older survivors faded quietly. Some were claimed by illness, some by storms. Some walked into the sea when their strength failed. Graves were shallow, marked more by memory than by stone. The wind worked constantly to erase them. 2 years in, desperation broke into motion. 18 castaways attempted escape on a crude raft built from the last substantial timber left on the island. They twisted fibers into rope, using hair as cordage when nothing else remained. A sail was fashioned from cloth and feathers. They pushed into open water and vanished. If they reached Madagascar, no record exists. If they died without witnesses, swallowed by distance. The attempt cost more than lives. It consumed materials that could not be replaced. After that, escape became almost unimaginable. Cyclone season returned every year like a verdict. Storm surge could cover the island completely. Wind drove sand into eyes and lungs, stripped skin raw. Shelters shook. People clung to coral walls while the sea tried to erase them. Survivors later spoke of nights when water rose around them and the world became sound. Yet afterward, the fire returned. Walls were rebuilt. Routine resumed. Survival was no longer dramatic, it was mechanical. As years passed, the community changed shape. Men disappeared faster than women, taken by failed escapes, storms, and labor that broke bodies down. By around 1770, nearly a decade after the wreck, only about 15 people remained. A matriarch emerged, an older woman whose authority came not from force but from experience. Decisions were made collectively, echoing village councils remembered from Madagascar. Cooperation was not idealism, it was efficiency. Language shifted. Malagasy words braided with fragments of French learned from sailors. Time was no longer measured in months or years, but in bird seasons and turtle nights. Rescue transformed from expectation to superstition, something spoken of carefully so as not to anger the world. And then, after 12 years, a sail appeared on the horizon. The survivors reacted with instincts shaped by disappointment. They fed the signal fire, throwing on fuel until black smoke climbed into the sky. They waved cloth, screamed until throats failed. The ship saw them. It approached. Hope, sudden and dangerous, broke open. The reef remained. A boat launched toward shore was overturned and destroyed. The ship circled, searching for a gap that did not exist. As daylight faded, it sailed away. Proof that the world could find them, followed immediately by abandonment. That moment carved deeper than hunger or storms. Some survivors refused to leave the beach for days. Others sank into a despair that looked like illness. It fell to the matriarch to pull them back into routine. If a ship had found them once, she argued, another might. The argument was thin, but it was enough to keep the fire alive. In 1776, rescue finally came, not as thunder, not as celebration, but as interruption. A French naval officer, Julien-Marie Crozet, sighted smoke rising from Tromelin. By then, smoke was not a miracle, it was routine. Still, this time the ship did not turn away. Smaller boats were launched carefully, guided through the reef with patience learned the hard way. When the sailors reached shore, they did not find a crowd rushing the water. They found 7 women and 1 infant. The survivors emerged slowly, dressed in garments made from seabird feathers, layered, stitched, deliberate. Clothing not of desperation, but of adaptation. For 15 years, the island had stripped them of everything that once marked status or ownership. What remained was function, memory, and dignity reshaped by necessity. Freedom was declared on the beach, words spoken formally, almost awkwardly, to people who had already been free in every way that mattered. They were no longer property, no longer castaways, no longer invisible. Yet even rescue carried its own quiet violence. Return was offered to Madagascar, to France, to the places they had been torn from. Some refused. Tromelin had taken years from them, but it had also become a world they understood. Home was no longer a location. It was a system of survival they had built with their own hands. Leaving it felt like another kind of loss. History tried to forget them again. For nearly 2 centuries, the story existed only in fragments, ship logs, passing mentions, footnotes. It would have been easy to dismiss it as legend, but the island resisted erasure. Archaeological excavations in the 21st century uncovered coral shelters, hearths, tools fashioned from shipwreck metal, jewelry made of shells and copper. Evidence not of chaos, but of order, not of savagery, but of community. The findings forced a re-evaluation. Survival here was not achieved through violence or domination. There was no evidence of hierarchy enforced by force, no signs of ritualized brutality. What endured was cooperation, shared labor, collective memory, leadership that emerged because it worked, not because it was imposed. This is where the story shifts from history to indictment. The suffering on Tromelin was not inevitable. It was designed by a system that calculated who was worth returning for and who could be postponed indefinitely. The sailors who left promised to come back. The institutions that allowed 15 years to pass without action were not faceless accidents. They were choices made slowly, quietly, and without consequence. And yet, the survivors built something the system never intended. They built a society where beauty resisted degradation, where routine defeated despair, where survival did not require becoming cruel. That is the real legacy of Tromelin. Not the rescue, not the ship, but the uncomfortable truth it leaves behind. What does it say about the world, then and now, when survival requires being forgotten?